The United States has just dropped multiple 5,000-pound deep penetrator bunker buster bombs on hardened Iranian missile sites, hugging the coastline of the Strait of Hormuz, striking positions that Tehran had used to threaten passing tankers. If these strikes do not fully silence the threat, the strait could stay blocked for weeks or longer, choking off 1/5 of global oil shipments, pushing energy prices into uncharted territory, forcing European factories to ration power and leaving Asian importers scrambling for emergency supplies that simply do not exist in the required volumes. Beneath the roar of these precision munitions lies a far larger contest among powers, where Washington seeks to reopen the world as most vital energy artery, while Tehran bets on sustained disruption to reshape regional influence and force outsiders to pay a heavier price for passage. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Friends, the pictures released by Central Command tell a story of calculated escalation. On the evening of the 17th of March, American aircraft delivered several GBU-72 advanced penetrators, each weighing 5,000 pounds and designed to burrow through reinforced concrete and rock before detonating deep underground. The targets were coastal launch sites for Iranian anti-ship cruise missiles, facilities that had been firing at vessels trying to transit the narrow waterway. Satellite imagery shared afterward showed craters where bunkers once stood, with secondary explosions confirming that munitions and fuel stores had been hit. Iranian state media has remained silent on the immediate damage, but shipping trackers show almost no commercial traffic moving through the strait since the latest round of warnings. The choice of weapon itself carries a message. The GBU-72 is not an ordinary bomb. It was built specifically to overcome deeply buried or heavily fortified targets that conventional munitions cannot reach. Its GPS guidance works regardless of weather or smoke, allowing strikes even when visibility is poor. American officials told reporters that these particular sites house systems capable of hitting tankers at ranges that cover the entire width of the strait. By using the heaviest conventional penetrator in the inventory, Washington signaled that it will not tolerate any continued attempt to hold global energy flows hostage. Yet the real difficulty begins after the smoke clears. Iranian forces have spent years digging these positions into the rocky shoreline, connecting them with tunnels and underground storage. Even if the surface installations are destroyed, hidden launchers or mobile units could still emerge to resume harassment. Tehran has already declared the strait closed in response to earlier actions, and its leaders have repeated that any attempt to force it open will meet fresh resistance. This creates a classic dilemma for the attacking side. How many more strikes are needed before the defender concludes that the cost of defiance is too high? At the same time, the economic ripples are already spreading far beyond the Gulf. Oil futures jumped sharply after the announcement, with traders pricing in the possibility of prolonged disruption. European buyers who depend on Gulf crude for winter stockpiles are now calculating how long their reserves will last if tankers cannot pass. Asian refineries that run on just in-time deliveries are quietly contacting alternative suppliers in West Africa and Latin America, though those routes add days and extra costs. Insurance rates for vessels near the strait have climbed again, and several shipping lines have simply canceled scheduled transits until the situation clarifies. The administration's public stance has been firm yet measured. Central Command emphasized that the strikes were limited and aimed solely at removing an immediate danger to international navigation. President Trump, however, has used stronger language on his platform, urging allies to join in protecting the waterway, while noting that many NATO partners have already declined. This mix of military action and diplomatic frustration reveals the limits of unilateral power in a region where geography favors the defender. If we step back a little further, the deeper pattern becomes visible. Control of the Strait of Hormuz has always been more than a military objective. It is a lever that can move the entire global economy. For decades, the United States maintained a naval presence there precisely to guarantee free passage. Now that Iran has demonstrated the ability to threaten that passage with relatively inexpensive missiles, Washington is forced to respond with high-value, high-precision assets. The asymmetry is striking. One side uses cheap drones and cruise missiles. The other answers with aircraft and specialized bombs costing millions each. This imbalance explains why the conflict feels both intense and inconclusive at the same time. Meanwhile, another layer of the contest is playing out in the diplomatic shadows. Gulf states that rely on the strait for their own exports are caught between supporting American efforts to reopen it and fearing Iranian retaliation against their own facilities. Some have quietly increased patrols in their territorial waters while avoiding public alignment with either side. European capitals are pressing Washington for a quick resolution, worried that higher energy prices will fuel inflation, just as their economies are recovering from earlier shocks. Beijing, as the largest single buyer of Gulf oil, watches the situation with strategic calm, adjusting its own tanker routes and drawing down reserves without rushing into public statements. The situation has reached the point where what began as targeted strikes is now testing the resilience of the entire energy trading system. Every day the strait remains closed adds another layer of cost that consumers around the world will eventually feel at the pump and in their monthly bills. Manufacturing contracts are being renegotiated, airline fuel surcharges are rising, and agricultural exporters are calculating how much extra it will cost to ship grain if sea routes become unreliable. These are not abstract numbers. They translate into real pressure on governments to find an exit ramp before domestic discontent grows. Iran's response so far has been to double down on its threat posture. State television has shown images of mobile launchers moving along the coast, reminding viewers that the country still possesses plenty of ways to make passage dangerous. This is classic deterrence logic. Make the price of reopening the strait higher than the benefit. Whether the latest American strikes have altered that calculation remains to be seen. The next few days will be critical in determining whether Iran chooses to test the new reality or seeks a face, saving way to reduce tensions. Here is where the human and strategic dimensions intersect. Leaders in Tehran know that prolonged closure hurts their own oil revenue as much as anyone else's. Yet they also understand that yielding too quickly would signal weakness. Washington faces the opposite pressure. It must demonstrate that it can protect global commons without becoming entangled in another endless Middle Eastern conflict. Both sides are balancing domestic politics against international consequences, a dance that has defined the region for generations. The military philosophy behind the American choice is worth noting. Bunker busters like the GBU-72 represent the belief that technology can solve problems that sheer numbers cannot. By penetrating deep underground, they aim to destroy not just the launchers, but the command nodes and supply lines that keep them operational yet. History shows that such technical solutions often meet adaptive responses. Iran has already dispersed many of its assets and practiced rapid relocation. The contest, therefore, becomes one of persistence. Can the attacker keep striking faster than the defender can rebuild and reposition? If we look a little wider, this episode fits into a longer pattern of great power competition over critical choke points. From the Suez Canal to the South China Sea, narrow waterways have repeatedly become arenas where local actors and distant powers collide. The lesson each time is the same. Whoever controls the flow controls leverage. In the current case, the stakes are particularly high because the global economy has not yet fully recovered from earlier disruptions. Any prolonged interruption here would compound existing vulnerabilities in supply chains and inflation pressures. The economic reordering already underway is subtle but unmistakable. Countries that once took stable Gulf oil for granted are now accelerating investments in alternatives, from renewables to new pipeline routes. Capital is flowing into projects that reduce dependence on any single waterway. This shift will not happen overnight, yet the direction is set. The current crisis is simply accelerating a trend that was latent in the system long before the first missile was fired. Friends, when you sit with these developments long enough, the whole affair begins to feel like a mirror held up to our interconnected age. The very arteries that carry the lifeblood of the modern economy have become its most vulnerable points. Ambition, geography, and technology keep colliding in ways that no single capital can fully master. The immediate focus remains on whether the latest strikes have created enough breathing room for diplomacy to regain traction. Tankers continue to wait outside the entrance. Markets keep watching every new statement, and ordinary people far away start noticing higher prices at the fuel pump. These are the human costs that remind us how distant conflicts still reach into daily life. Yet the deeper risk lies in the possibility of miscalculation. Each new round of strikes hardens positions and makes compromise more expensive. The facilities still smoking along the Iranian coast and the empty shipping lanes serve as daily reminders that once the machinery of escalation begins turning, stopping it requires more than military force alone. The real test now is whether these precision strikes have altered the fundamental equation on the ground. The GBU-72 was chosen precisely because it can reach targets that ordinary bombs cannot touch. Yet Iranian engineers have spent years preparing for exactly this kind of assault. Tunnels carved into the coastal cliffs, mobile launchers hidden in nearby valleys, and dispersed command posts mean that destroying fixed bunkers is only the first step in a much longer game of cat and mouse. Tehran has already shown it can shift assets quickly, and its leaders understand that as long as even a handful of anti-ship missiles remain operational, the threat to tankers will keep insurance rates sky high and shipping companies away. This is the classic defender's advantage in asymmetric warfare. The attacker must be perfect every time, while the defender needs only one successful shot to create chaos. Meanwhile, the economic pressure is mounting in ways that go far beyond the immediate price of oil. Shipping data shows traffic through the strait has dropped dramatically, with many vessels rerouting around Africa at enormous extra cost in time and fuel. European refineries that rely on steady Gulf crude are quietly drawing down strategic reserves while negotiating emergency deals with suppliers in Nigeria and Brazil. Asian buyers, who account for the bulk of the Strait's daily throughput, are accelerating long-term contracts for Russian and American crude, even though those sources come with their own political complications. The ripple effects are already visible in higher freight rates, delayed factory orders, and anxious boardrooms where executives are recalculating quarterly forecasts. What started as a military operation has become a stress test for the entire global energy trading system. At the same time, diplomatic calculations are shifting quietly in capitals far from the Gulf. Gulf monarchies that depend on the Strait for their own exports are walking a tightrope. They support the goal of reopening the waterway, but fear Iranian retaliation against their own facilities if they appear too closely aligned with Washington. Some have quietly bolstered coastal patrols and shared intelligence while avoiding public statements that could be read as provocation. European governments are urging restraint and quick resolution, worried that sustained high energy prices will undermine their fragile economic recovery and fuel political unrest at home. Beijing, as the largest single importer of Gulf oil, continues its policy of measured detachment, using the breathing space to fill strategic reserves and diversify sources without issuing dramatic pronouncements. These parallel tracks of diplomacy illustrate how a single choke point can force every major power to reassess its priorities simultaneously. The deeper military lesson here concerns the limits of technology when geography and preparation are on the defender's side. The GBU-72 represents years of American investment in penetrating deeply buried targets, yet its success depends on accurate intelligence and the ability to strike repeatedly if needed. Iran's strategy of dispersal and mobility turns that technological edge into a game of attrition. Each additional strike costs the United States in munitions, aircraft hours, and political capital, while the defender can absorb losses and still retain the capacity to threaten shipping. This dynamic echoes earlier conflicts where superior firepower met adaptive guerrilla tactics, reminding us that control of vital sea lanes is never settled by a single barrage. If we draw a brief parallel from history without dwelling on the past, we see echoes of the 1980s tanker war in the same waters, when both sides learned that disrupting oil flows carries global consequences that eventually force even the strongest players to seek an off-ramp. Today, S version is faster and more interconnected, with markets reacting in minutes rather than weeks. Yet the underlying logic remains the same. When the cost of closure becomes unbearable for all parties, compromise begins to look possible. The question is whether the current strikes have raised that cost high enough to move the needle. This brings us to the human and strategic realities that leaders on all sides must confront. Iranian commanders know that prolonged closure damages their own economy and international standing. Yet they also recognize that appearing to yield under pressure would invite further demands. American planners understand that while the strikes demonstrate resolve, they risk turning a contained operation into a wider confrontation. If Iran responds with new tactics or draws in proxies, both sides are navigating the tension between projecting strength and avoiding escalation that neither can fully control. In that tension lies the real risk of miscalculation, where each new move seems justified yet collectively pushes the region closer to the edge. The economic reordering already visible offers a glimpse of longer-term shifts. Countries that once treated Gulf oil as a given are now investing more seriously in alternatives, from accelerated renewable projects to new pipeline routes that bypass the strait entirely. Capital markets are pricing in higher baseline volatility for energy, encouraging diversification even among traditional buyers. This transition will not happen overnight, but the current crisis acts as a catalyst, speeding up trends that were already latent in the system. Over time, the strategic value of the strait may diminish as the world's energy mix changes, though that process will be measured in years rather than weeks. Philosophically, the episode underscores a recurring truth about power and vulnerability. Great powers have always sought to secure their lifelines through superior force, only to discover that those lifelines can be turned against them when adversaries master the art of disruption. The pattern repeats because geography is stubborn, resources are finite, and human ambition finds new ways to exploit weaknesses. What changes across eras is the speed and reach of the contest. Today, as precision munitions and instant markets have compressed the timeline, making every decision more consequential and every misstep more expensive. In that compression lies both danger and the possibility of new equilibria emerging from the pressure. Looking forward, several pathways are emerging from the smoke. One is a negotiated pause once the accumulated economic pain forces all parties to the table. Such a pause would not erase underlying grievances, but could create space for diplomacy to regain traction. Another is accelerated global investment in energy alternatives, gradually reducing the strait's centrality and thereby lowering the stakes of future confrontations. A third, more concerning possibility is sustained low-level harassment that keeps the waterway dangerous enough to deter normal traffic without triggering full-scale war. The actual course will depend on the interplay of fatigue, domestic politics, and external mediation, factors that no single actor can dictate alone. What is already clear is that the old assumption of unchallenged passage is gone. The question now is what new balance will replace it. In the meantime, ordinary people far from the Gulf continue to absorb the indirect consequences. Higher fuel costs work their way through transportation networks, manufacturing supply chains, and household budgets. Families in Europe face the prospect of tighter energy rationing if winter reserves run low. Workers in Asian factories see production schedules disrupted when raw materials become uncertain. Investors everywhere adjust portfolios in anticipation of prolonged uncertainty. These human costs accumulate quietly but persistently, serving as the most tangible reminder that distant conflicts still shape daily life in an interconnected world. The deeper insight here concerns the limits of unilateral control in an era of diffused power. No matter how advanced the weaponry, no single nation can dictate terms when the system itself has grown too complex and interdependent. Attempts to enforce outcomes through force alone tend to generate adaptive resistance that prolongs the struggle. This is an old lesson, yet one that each generation seems destined to relearn at considerable cost. The current events around the strait are simply the latest chapter in that enduring story, as the dust settles over the coastal sites and shipping lanes remain eerily quiet. The real contest is shifting from immediate military targets to the longer-term questions of energy security, diplomatic leverage, and global economic resilience. The side that best understands these new realities will ultimately hold the stronger position. For now, the immediate priority remains preventing further escalation while keeping vital sea lanes open. Yet beneath that urgency runs a quieter recognition that the world's energy map is being redrawn, and the old certainties about who controls the flow no longer fully apply. Friends, these developments invite us all to reflect more deeply on the fragile connections that bind the global economy and the choices that shape our shared future. In the comments below, I genuinely want to hear your thoughts. How do you see the balance of energy security and military power evolving from here? What lessons should we draw about the limits of technology and the enduring power of geography? Your perspectives help sharpen the conversation and enrich our collective understanding. Thank you for staying with me through this full analysis. Until next time, stay observant and take care.